Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I accidentally stumbled across my mom's secret, I thought nothing could shock me more. Turns out, her affair wasn't just with anyone. It was with my best friend's dad. And when I confronted her, she didn't apologize, she blamed me. What followed was a whirlwind of betrayal, lies, and a family falling apart. It all started with a text I wasn't supposed to see. My mom had asked me to use her phone to look up a recipe she'd saved, something I'd done countless times before. But as I scrolled through her notes, a notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was from someone named Paul, and the message was short but strange. Same time next week? Can't stop thinking about you. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe Paul was someone from work, or perhaps it was a harmless message taken out of context. My mom wasn't the type to have secrets. She was the glue that held our family together, always reminding me and my younger brother, Liam, to be honest and upfront with one another. But the way the message was worded didn't sit right with me. Can't stop thinking about you? It sounded far too intimate for a co-worker or casual acquaintance. Still, I brushed it off, convincing myself I was overthinking things. Mom didn't have a secret life. She couldn't. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling the text had left behind. My mom seemed her usual cheerful self, chatting with Liam about his soccer practice and asking me about my plans for the weekend. But every time I looked at her, I couldn't help but think about Paul's message. Finally, after dinner, I decided to casually bring it up. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "Who's Paul?" The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Mom, who had been putting dishes in the sink, froze mid-motion. Slowly, she turned to face me, her expression carefully neutral. "Paul?" she repeated, as if she didn't know who I was talking about. "Yeah," I said, feeling my heart start to race. "I saw a text from him earlier on your phone. Something about next week." Her face flushed, and she quickly turned back to the sink. "Oh, Paul," she said, her voice a little too light. "He's just an old friend. Nothing to worry about." The way she brushed it off didn't sit well with me. My mom was usually an open book, quick to explain or clarify anything. But this time, she seemed flustered, almost defensive. "An old friend?" I pressed, trying to sound curious rather than accusatory. "Yes," she said quickly, her back still turned to me. "We used to work together years ago. He's just reaching out to catch up." Her explanation sounded plausible, but something about her tone made me suspicious. It was clipped, as if she wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible. I decided to let it go for now. But as I went to bed that night, the unease lingered. The message, her reaction, the way she avoided looking at me when she answered, it didn't add up. Little did I know that one message would be the first thread unraveling a secret that would change everything I thought I knew about my mom, my family, and my best friend. After that night, it was like a switch flipped in my mind. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before, small details that in hindsight felt glaringly obvious. For one, my mom's appearance had changed. She'd always been practical, favoring jeans and simple blouses, with her hair in a loose ponytail. But now, she was dressing differently. Sleek dresses, carefully applied makeup, and perfume she hadn't worn in years became part of her routine. When I asked why, she laughed it off. "It's nice to feel good about yourself," she said, but the sudden transformation felt more calculated than spontaneous. Then there were the errands. Mom had always been efficient with her time, never one to linger at the grocery store or run out for something that could wait. But now, she was gone for hours at a time, claiming she had things to take care of. I tried not to read too much into it, but the excuses were piling up. One evening, she came home unusually late. Liam and I had already eaten dinner, and I was sitting on the couch when I heard the door open. Traffic was terrible, Mom said as she walked in, dropping her purse on the counter. She looked flustered, her cheeks flushed in a way that didn't seem like the result of sitting in a car. "Long days?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Very," she replied, avoiding my eyes as she rummaged through her bag. As she turned to head upstairs, something caught my eye, a faint smudge of lipstick on her collar. It wasn't her usual shade, a subtle pink she wore on special occasions. This was a bold red, the kind she never wore. "Mom, your shirt," I started, but she interrupted. "I'll be right back," she said quickly, disappearing up the stairs before I could say anything more. The next day, I couldn't ignore my growing suspicion. I felt guilty even considering it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my mom wasn't being honest. When she stepped out to run errands, I saw my opportunity. I grabbed her phone from where it was charging in the kitchen. I knew it was wrong, a complete invasion of her privacy, but my curiosity overpowered my guilt. I opened her messages and scrolled until I found Paul's name. My stomach tightened as I tapped on the thread. What I found shocked me. There were dozens of texts, each one more personal than the last. They weren't just catching up, they were deeply involved. Messages like, "I haven't felt this alive in years," and "I wish we didn't have to hide," filled the screen. But one text in particular made my heart sink. "I wish things were different. You make me feel alive again." I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just an innocent friendship or a harmless flirtation. My mom was having an affair. As I put the phone back, my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do or how to process what I'd just discovered. Part of me wanted to confront her right away, but another part of me was terrified of what that confrontation would bring. I couldn't stop thinking about the texts, about what they meant for our family. And worse, I couldn't stop wondering. It was Paul, really? I couldn't get the texts out of my mind. The words swirled in my head like a storm, each message more incriminating than the last. But there was one text that stood out, one that included a full name, Paul Henderson. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Paul Henderson wasn't just some random guy. He was Emily's dad, my best friend's father. For a moment, I sat frozen, unable to process the connection. Paul and his wife, Karen, were practically extended family to us. Our families had shared countless barbecues, holiday gatherings, and weekend trips. Emily and I grew up side by side, inseparable from the moment we met in kindergarten. And now, the idea that my mom was involved with her dad felt like the ultimate betrayal. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe there was another Paul Henderson. Maybe it wasn't that Paul. But deep down, I knew the truth. The messages were too personal, too specific. This wasn't just a casual fling with a stranger. This was a secret that could destroy both of our families. The memories of every interaction between our moms and dads flooded my mind. Paul, laughing with my dad at the grill during one of our family cookouts. Karen and my mom chatting over glasses of wine, while Emily and I ran off to plan our next adventure. It all felt tainted now, like those moments were part of a lie I hadn't known I was living. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could my mom do this? To me, to our family, to Emily. Emily was more than my best friend. She was practically a sister. If she ever found out about this, it would crush her. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, going over every interaction I'd ever witnessed between my mom and Paul. Had there been signs I'd missed? Lingering looks? Inside jokes? I hated myself for not seeing it sooner, for not piecing it together before now. That evening, I sat on my bed, staring at my phone. I thought about calling Emily, telling her everything. But what would I even say? "Hey, just a heads up, your dad's been having an affair with my mom?" The words felt impossible to say out loud. Instead, I opened the texts again, scrolling through them with fresh eyes. This time, I wasn't just looking for proof of their affair. I was looking for answers. How long had this been going on? What were they planning to do? One message stood out. "I wish we didn't have to sneak around. Maybe one day, we won't have to." The implication was clear. They were thinking about a future together. My stomach turned at the thought. If they were planning to blow up their marriages for this, what would happen to Emily? To me? I put the phone down, my head spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The secret was too big to ignore, but I didn't know how to confront it. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew about my mom and my family was about to change forever. The weight of the secret became unbearable, pressing down on me until I couldn't hold it in any longer. That night, I waited for the right moment, pacing my room as I rehearsed what I was going to say. When I heard my mom in the kitchen, alone and washing dishes, I knew it was now or never. Clutching my phone in one hand, my heart pounding in my chest, I walked in. She looked up and smiled briefly before returning her focus to the sink. "Hey, sweetie," she said casually, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. "Is there something you need to tell me?" I asked, my voice tight but controlled. She turned to me, confused. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated for a moment, my resolve wavering. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, and the look on her face when I asked her about Paul the first time. I took a deep breath and held up my phone, the screenshots glowing on the screen. "Paul," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "Emily's dad." "What's going on, Mom?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But instead, her expression shifted. Shock gave way to anger. "You went through my phone?" she snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. "That's what you're focusing on?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You're having an affair with my best friend's dad, And you're mad at me for finding out? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she turned back to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter as if steadying herself. You don't understand, she said finally, her voice trembling. Then help me understand, I said, stepping closer. How could you do this? To Dad, to me, to Emily? What were you thinking? It's not what you think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh, really? I said, holding up the phone again. Because this looks exactly like what I think it is. You're sneaking around with Emily's dad, lying to everyone and pretending like nothing's wrong. So tell me, Mom, what am I missing? She turned to face me, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't plan this. But things with your father, they haven't been right for years. And Paul, he makes me feel... I cut her off, shaking my head in disbelief. I don't care how he makes you feel, I said, my voice trembling with anger. What about how this makes me feel? Or Emily? Or Dad? Did you even think about any of us? For the first time, she looked genuinely ashamed, but her defensiveness quickly returned. I didn't want you to find out like this, she said, as if that somehow made it better. Yeah, well, maybe you shouldn't have done it in the first place, I said, my voice cracking. The confrontation left me shaking, my emotions a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. I had always looked up to my mom, trusted her, believed she was someone who would always do the right thing. But now, I saw her in a completely different light. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said quietly, turning to leave the kitchen. Her voice stopped me as I reached the door. Please don't tell anyone, she said, her tone desperate. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I knew was that nothing about our family, or my life, would ever be the same. The day after our confrontation, my mom cornered me in the living room. Her eyes were red and puffy, her demeanor hesitant, almost fragile. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I didn't want to talk. Didn't want to hear her try to explain away what she'd done. But part of me needed answers. Needed to understand how the woman I trusted most could have done something so devastating. I nodded reluctantly, folding my arms as I sat down on the couch. She perched on the edge of the chair across from me, wringing her hands. I know you're angry, she began, and you have every right to be. But you have to understand it's complicated. I scoffed, shaking my head. Complicated? I repeated. You're having an affair with my best friend's dad, Mom. What's complicated about that? She flinched at my words, as if hearing the truth out loud made it harder to bear. Your dad and I, we haven't been happy for a long time, she said finally, her voice trembling. We've been drifting apart for years. And Paul, he made me feel seen, like I mattered again. Her words stung more than I cared to admit. Seen? I said, my tone sharp. What about Dad? What about Liam and me? Do we not make you feel like you matter? That's not what I mean, she said quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't understand what it's like to be in a marriage for so long. To feel invisible in your own home. Paul, he made me feel alive again, like I was more than just a wife or a mom. Her excuses only fueled my anger. So that makes it okay? I snapped. That gives you permission to betray your family? To destroy Emily's family, too. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I never meant for it to happen, she said, her voice muffled. And I never meant for you to find out. Do you hear yourself? I said, my voice rising. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. Her silence was deafening. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to rein in my emotions. This isn't about you feeling invisible, I said finally, my voice trembling with frustration. This is about you betraying our family. And Emily's. Do you even care about what this will do to her? To her mom? She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. But she didn't answer, and that silence said everything. I walked out of the room, unable to stand the sight of her any longer. Her excuses, her tears, they felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to justify something that couldn't be justified. In the days that followed, she tried to talk to me again, but I refused to engage. Every time I looked at her, I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak, the image of the woman I'd always admired replaced by someone I barely recognized. Her betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the selfishness, the complete disregard for how her actions would affect the people she claimed to love. And no matter how many excuses she offered, nothing could undo the damage she'd done. It didn't take long for the affair to unravel completely. I had been carrying the weight of the secret for days, unable to look Emily in the eye without feeling like I was betraying her. Finally, I decided I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. She deserved to know the truth, even if it destroyed our friendship. When I told her, she stared at me in stunned silence, her face pale. "You're lying," she said finally, shaking her head. "My dad wouldn't do that. Not with your mom." "I wish I was lying," I said softly, my heart breaking as I watched the realization dawn on her. "But I've seen the texts. It's true." Emily refused to believe me at first, storming out of my house without another word. Later that night, she texted me, saying she had confronted her dad. Her message was short and devastating. He didn't deny it. The next time I saw her, it was as if she was a completely different person. Her eyes were red and swollen, her usually bright and cheerful demeanor replaced by anger and pain. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I didn't know how," I admitted. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Well, you did," she said coldly. "You've ruined everything." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to explain that I wasn't the one who caused the affair, but she wouldn't listen. To her, I was just as guilty for keeping it a secret, for being part of the web of lies that had torn her family apart. Our once unbreakable friendship crumbled overnight. Emily stopped answering my calls and avoided me at school. Seeing her in the hallways, her icy glares cutting through me, was almost too much to bear. At home, the fallout was just as bad, if not worse. My dad found out about the affair after overhearing one of my arguments with my mom. The moment the truth came out, everything in our house shifted. The arguments were relentless, echoing through the walls at all hours of the day. My dad demanded answers, yelling about betrayal and lies, while my mom either defended herself or retreated into silence. Liam, caught in the crossfire, stayed in his room most of the time, pretending not to hear the chaos unfolding around him. My mom, instead of owning up to her actions, turned her anger on me. "If you hadn't gone through my phone, none of this would have happened," she shouted during one particularly heated argument. "You're seriously blaming me?" I yelled back, incredulous. "You're the one who had the affair. If you just stayed out of it, everything would still be fine," she snapped. "Fine?" I repeated, my voice breaking. How is lying to everyone and sneaking around fine? The tension in the house became unbearable. My dad moved into the guest room, and every interaction between my parents was laced with bitterness. Family dinners were a thing of the past, replaced by awkward silences and separate meals. I felt like I was living in the middle of a war zone, caught between parents who were supposed to be the foundation of my life. The guilt and anger weighed heavily on me, making it hard to focus on anything else. I knew the truth needed to come out, but the cost had been higher than I ever imagined. Emily hated me, my family was falling apart, and my mom seemed more concerned with shifting the blame than repairing the damage she'd caused. The fallout was devastating, and I wasn't sure if any of us would ever recover. The atmosphere in our house had become unbearable. My dad barely spoke. My mom alternated between defensiveness and silence, and Liam tried his best to stay invisible. As for me, I couldn't look at my mom without feeling a surge of anger. Her refusal to own up to her actions was the final straw. One night, as I was heading upstairs, I heard my mom call my name from the kitchen. Reluctantly, I turned back, finding her standing at the counter with a glass of wine in her hand. Her expression was a mix of anger and exhaustion. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. "What is there to talk about?" I asked coldly. "You made your choices. Now you're dealing with the consequences." Her face hardened. "You think this is easy for me?" she snapped. "You had no right to invade my privacy. If you hadn't gone through my phone, none of this would have happened." Her words were like a slap to the face. I stared at her, disbelief and anger bubbling to the surface. "Are you serious right now?" I shouted. "I'm not the one who had an affair. How can you stand there and blame me for your choices?" "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like you're invisible in your own life. I did what I had to do to survive." Her excuses felt hollow, a desperate attempt to shift the blame away from herself. "Survive," I repeated, my voice shaking with frustration. "You destroyed our family and Emily's, and you're standing here acting like the victim?" Her grip tightened around the wine glass, her knuckles white. "I made a mistake," she said finally. "But it wasn't just about me. Your father and we've been broken for years. Paul, he was there for me in a way your dad hasn't been for a long time." I shook my head, disgusted by her attempt to justify the affair. "If things were so bad, why didn't you talk to Dad? Or go to therapy? Or literally anything else that didn't involve sneaking around with someone else's husband?" She didn't answer, and the silence between us was suffocating. My dad's voice broke the tension. "What's going on in here?" he asked, stepping into the room. His eyes flicked between us, his expression weary. "She's blaming me," I said, my voice laced with bitterness. "Apparently, it's my fault for finding out the truth." My dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned and left the room, heading back to the guest room he'd been sleeping in for weeks. The tension in the house was suffocating. My dad's silence was just as loud as my mom's excuses, and every interaction felt like walking on eggshells. Liam avoided us entirely, hiding in his room or staying out late with friends. My mom's refusal to take responsibility only made things worse. Every time I tried to bring up how her actions had affected us, she'd deflect, turning the conversation back on me or my dad. "If he'd been more present, maybe I wouldn't have felt so alone," she said once, as if that excused everything. I couldn't take it anymore. Her unwillingness to face the consequences of her choices made it impossible to have any sort of resolution. The house that had once been my safe haven now felt like a battleground, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could take it. The blame game had become her defense, but it only drove us further apart. The more she tried to justify herself, the more distant I felt from the woman I used to call my role model. The aftermath of the affair rippled far beyond the walls of our house. The secret was out, and the damage was spreading like wildfire. Emily's family was unraveling before my eyes, and my once unshakable friendship with her had become a casualty of the chaos. Emily's parents were in the middle of a messy separation. Paul had moved out of their home, and Karen was left trying to pick up the pieces. Emily, caught in the crossfire, was angry and heartbroken. Every time I saw her at school, she looked at me with a mix of betrayal and resentment, as if I were personally responsible for what had happened. "I trusted you," she said one day when we passed each other in the hallway. Her voice was low, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "How could you let this happen?" Our once close friend group started to fracture as well. Some people sympathized with me, saying I couldn't be blamed for my mom's choices. Others, however, avoided me entirely, not wanting to get involved in the drama. The whispers followed me everywhere. "Did you hear what her mom did?" people would say, their voices barely hushed as I walked by. It felt like I was living under a microscope, every glance and whisper a reminder of how my life had imploded. I tried to focus on my schoolwork, hoping to distract myself, but even that felt impossible. The weight of the fallout hung over me like a cloud, making it hard to concentrate on anything. The people I thought I could rely on, Emily, my friends, had either turned on me or distanced themselves, leaving me feeling like an outcast in my own life. At home, things weren't any better. My mom had fully embraced a role as the victim, doubling down on her defensiveness and refusing to acknowledge the pain she had caused. "You don't know what it's like to be in my shoes," she said one night during yet another argument. "And I don't care," I shot back, my voice trembling with frustration. "Do you even realize what you've done? To me? To Emily? To Dad?" Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "I've made mistakes, but so has everyone else. Don't act like I'm the only one at fault here." Her refusal to take responsibility was infuriating. Every conversation with her felt like running into a brick wall. She was so focused on justifying her actions that she couldn't, or wouldn't, see the devastation she had left in her wake. The bonds that had once held my life together, my friendship with Emily, my family, my sense of stability, were broken, and I didn't know how to fix them. I missed the days when things were simple, when Emily and I could talk about anything, when my family felt like a safe place. But those days felt like a lifetime ago, replaced by a reality where every relationship in my life was strained or shattered. As much as I wanted to hold on to the pieces of what I'd lost, I couldn't ignore the truth. Some things were broken beyond repair, and no amount of apologies or explanations could put them back together. The tension in our house had been building for weeks, simmering just beneath the surface. Every interaction with my mom felt like a minefield, each conversation threatening to explode into another argument. But the breaking point came one evening when everything finally boiled over. We were in the living room, and it started as a simple disagreement about dinner plans. I can't even remember what triggered it, but before I knew it, we were yelling at each other, voices echoing through the house. "You've destroyed this family," I shouted, unable to hold back my frustration any longer. She glared at me, her eyes cold and unflinching. "No," she said sharply. "You destroyed it when you stuck your nose where it didn't belong." Her words were like a knife to the chest. I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and anger. You're seriously blaming me for this? I said, my voice trembling. You're the one who had the affair, the one who lied to all of us. How is any of this my fault? You don't understand, she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. You've made everything worse by dragging this out. If you just stayed out of it, we could have handled this as a family. A family? I repeated, incredulous. What family are you talking about? The one you destroyed when you decided to cheat on Dad? Or the one you betrayed when you got involved with Emily's dad? Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further. You're not perfect either, she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. You've made mistakes too. This isn't about me, I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. This is about you refusing to take responsibility for what you've done. You don't care about fixing anything. You just care about protecting your image. For a moment, she didn't respond, and the silence between us was deafening. I could feel the weight of her anger, her refusal to back down, and I realized then that she wasn't going to change. She wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to own up to her mistakes. I can't do this anymore, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Her eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done, I said, turning to head upstairs. I can't live under the same roof as someone who refuses to take responsibility for their actions. That night, I packed a bag with just the essentials, clothes, toiletries, my laptop. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't stay. Every corner of the house felt suffocating, filled with memories that were now tainted by betrayal and anger. I texted my friend Clara, explaining the situation in as few words as possible. Within minutes, she responded, telling me I could stay with her as long as I needed. I left the house without saying another word to my mom, the weight of her indifference pressing down on me with every step. Staying at Clara's felt like a breath of fresh air, but it didn't erase the pain of what I'd left behind. I missed my dad and Liam, missed the family I'd thought I had. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not until my mom took responsibility for the damage she'd caused. Leaving was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the only choice I had left. Living in that house had become unbearable, and I needed space to figure out how to move forward. The breaking point had shattered what little remained of our relationship, and as much as it hurt, I knew it was time to let go. Leaving home was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the most necessary. For weeks, I felt like I was living in a haze, trying to process everything that had happened. The chaos my mom had created had turned my life upside down, and I needed space to heal, to figure out who I was outside of the wreckage of our family. At Clara's, I found a strange sense of peace. Her family welcomed me without question, offering a quiet stability I hadn't realized I was missing. I threw myself into school and work, using the routine as a way to distract myself from the hurt. But late at night, when the world was still, the memories would creep back in, and the ache of what I'd lost felt almost unbearable. Despite the distance, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. We hadn't spoken since the fallout, but her absence left a void I couldn't ignore. She had been my best friend, my confidant, and losing her felt like losing a piece of myself. It took months, but eventually, Emily and I found a fragile truce. It started with a tentative message from her, asking if we could talk. I agreed, nervous about what she might say, but desperate to mend a rift between us. When we met at a quiet cafe, the tension was palpable. I'm sorry, I said before she could even speak. For everything. For not telling you sooner. For the mess this caused. She looked at me, her expression guarded. I'm sorry too, she said finally. I shouldn't have blamed you. None of this was your fault. The conversation was raw and emotional, filled with apologies and shared pain. While we both agreed that our friendship would never be the same, we also realized that we were victims of circumstances beyond our control. We didn't ask for this, she said, her voice trembling. But we're the ones left picking up the pieces. Her words resonated deeply. The betrayal we'd experienced had reshaped our lives, but it had also given us a shared understanding, an unspoken bond forged in the aftermath of heartbreak. As for my mom, it took much longer to rebuild any semblance of a relationship. For months, I avoided her calls and texts, unable to face the person who had caused so much damage. But over time, I realized that cutting her out completely wasn't sustainable. When we finally spoke, it was clear that the distance had softened her defensiveness. I'm sorry, she said quietly during our first real conversation. For everything. For hurting you, for not taking responsibility. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right. Her apology was long overdue, but it was a start. While I wasn't ready to fully forgive her, I allowed her back into my life in small, measured ways. Family dinners were replaced with occasional coffee meetups, and our conversations stayed light, avoiding the deeper wounds we both knew would take time to heal. Some wounds, I realized, are too deep to heal completely. My relationship with my mom would never go back to what it was, but that was okay. I didn't need perfection. I just needed honesty and effort. And for the first time, she seemed willing to give that. Walking away from the life I'd known had been heartbreaking, but it taught me an invaluable lesson. Sometimes, you have to choose peace over family. Setting boundaries wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my own well-being. In the end, I learned that healing isn't about erasing the pain. It's about learning to live with it and finding strength in the process. My family was fractured, my friendships altered, but I found a resilience I didn't know I had. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting what had happened, but it did mean refusing to let it define me. And in that choice, I found the freedom to rebuild my life on my own terms.